Good afternoon. Welcome to the artist talk and our opening reception that will start at 4 p.m. So we'll start with Monika Fabianska, who is the curator of this exhibition, and this exhibition is originated from New York, was originated in New York, and we are really excited to have it here almost 2 months after its New York premiere. Monika Fabianska is the New York-based art historian and curator who specializes in women and art made by women artists. Without further ado, let's welcome Monika.
And we hacked a little bit original plan for this. We're going to do this walkthrough together. So let me also introduce to those of you who haven't heard from Lesia yet. Lesia Khomenko is one of the artists in the exhibition, the painter whose work is here. So we will do this walkthrough in a little bit less formal way, and we will pass the mic between us discussing the works. She will discuss her own works, and I think that this will be more natural than doing it another way. Yeah? Is that how we want to do that? Okay. There is no particular order of looking at the works in this exhibition. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I see that there are quite some new faces comparing to the press conference that we had before. So let me tell you how the exhibition is constructed in a few words, and then we'll walk through the works. So first of all, these are the works by some of the best Ukrainian women artists, contemporary artists. There are more of the best artists in the country. It's a very talented nation, but all of them have museum exhibitions in Europe, in their biographies, participation in international biennials. You really are looking at the best artists that Ukraine has, and that's important to have this perspective. Secondly, roughly half of the works that you're looking at were created during the 8 years since 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia and the beginning of the war in Donbass that continues until today. And the other half of works were created since after February 24th, that is the full-scale land invasion of Russia on Ukraine this year. I decided to give the floor to women narrators of war as the central element of history, without any particular preconception of what I would hear. I just assumed it would be something interesting, and indeed it is. I don't want to generalize. Generalizations are not perfect, but not all of these works are about women or their fates. What I encourage you to try to see in these works is rather their gaze or their intention, their interpretation of the war that goes in different directions, and we'll touch upon that. I decided to devote it to feminist historiography because art is historiography. If we look back at history, we mostly learn of what happened before us through text and through art. And most of what we know was created by men. So even if women are represented in historical texts and paintings, they are most often not made by women. So the perspective changes. What else? This exhibition provides an insight into Eastern European feminism, which is quite different in American, quite different in the Western. And it's something that I always mention that is worth further exploration, but you will see certain differences in particular works. And there was a reason to dive particularly into historiography. Not only because I was interested in it, not only because I thought it would be interesting to listen to women, but because Ukraine has been for a while in such an impossibly complicated situation, torn between its colonial past, between its imagination or hope and ambition to be a free country, independent country with ties to the West, and the reality of ongoing crisis that is also following in footsteps of previous tragedies. If you think of the Holodomor, which was an imposed famine, artificial famine in the 1920s or 30s, I always get it wrong, 30s, by Stalin. Then both World Wars and the Holocaust, you understand that the nation over 3 generations lost millions of people, and that the trauma, of course, is overwhelming. So in this context, when you try to create your own national identity and you look back and all that you see is a Soviet past, how do you define yourself? So this struggle has been very present, and you can speak to this. I will actually pass the mic to you this moment, in the works of artists in Ukraine during at least the last 10 years. Historiography became the main topic.
Thank you. My name is Lesia Khomenko. I'm Kyiv-based artist who recently in evacuation. And I'm presenting here for big-scale paintings from different series. And I'm very briefly introduce it, and then really I would like to continue Monica's intention about historical reference and historical research of our generation. Actually, it's a figurative paintings I did after the beginning of full invasion, and it's my first work in early March, depicting my husband, musician and media artist Max, who got to army, and now he's in Ukraine in army. And at that time he was looking like this, without uniform, military uniform, but in a casual outfit. But he had already gone because he was like lieutenant. So for me, it's a link between normal life, civil life, and war, and the fact that like all society involved, and not even Ukrainian society, but it's like all civil society involved in this war, like through like peaceful image to show that war, it's like total. And other works depict soldiers from photos I took from internet. I experienced it after escaping Kyiv and moving to the West. I spent 2 months in Poland. I realized that my experience is very different from people around me, from Western people, because I'm using another kind of resources to get information. And it's very about informational war, and about footage in internet, and about the truth. We all know that what about the truth? So, and I think it's a very crucial question. So I'm collecting the images of selfies of soldiers, but soldiers, by doing selfies, blurring their faces and background, because it's very dangerous, because next day they could be shelling by Russians. So photography for me turned to the weapon, not just tool for paintings. And in Ukraine it's forbidden to shoot, to take a photo, I mean, of soldiers, of military objects, of weapons, of everything, because it could be used. So for me, it's like new kind of self-representation of the army, of the soldiers and the war itself. And in this point, I'm really referring to the history of art, especially Ukrainian, because it's based on a figurative painting very strongly, both like 19th century and Soviet realistic period, which was like 70 years. And this period of social realism school still present in Ukraine because of the style of education, of higher education in art, because we still have this realistic kind of trainings, mostly. And it's very connected to the history consciousness in our country, that we're still stuck in some very problematic issues, and we can't, until this war happened, we still can't agree inside society about periods, about World War II, about whole history, and all 20th century divided on different periods, like before Soviet Revolution, after Soviet Revolution, Ukrainian republics, World War II, Stepan Bandera, and of course killing intellectuals, writers, like Stalinistic repression, which took place in 30s and in 60s as well, up to 80s. So it's very controversial. And now we have like state policy that leads to like erased a huge piece of this history, erases Soviet past. And for us, as in for artists, very important not to erase it, but analyze, and through different artistic, visual artistic approaches, we could really make complex research. My colleague Ladana Konechna said that it's like hooligans kind of research, because it's based on artistic practice, and it not necessarily so deeply goes in academical level, but it makes more complex experiments, for example. So we are working with museums and with museums collections of Soviet art. Me personally, I'm working with social realistic images over 10 years. I turned especially period of 50s, which based on this Stalinist depicting of World War II, or depicting of the battles. I mean, it's very important for me. It's like mythologization instead, history research, and it's so deeply sets in our consciousness, still in my generation. So it's very important to work with this critically, of course, and to work in the field of painting is also very important, because I could deconstruct this knowledge with its own language, and it's quite clear in Ukraine, but at the same time makes something forward. Also to reflect that we didn't have the common history with Western world, so we didn't have any minimalist abstract painting and so on. So like how we could now merge with global art world through our background. And I'm very happy that in this exhibition, Monica includes this historic aspect, which makes our own voices more strong, and we like recognize ourselves in this exhibition as we like do. I mean, if I, yes.
Sweet, thank you. What was wonderful when you were saying, I was thinking which work to take you next to, and actually as you were speaking, you were tying to almost every work in this exhibition. It's so wonderful as they are all connected. There's really no one direction that we could go, but let's follow to the other room. If you started speaking about paintings and especially socialist realism, there are two other works that were created in direct response to these traditions, so I think it makes sense to discuss them now to tie to what Lesia just introduced. This series of drawings, titled Communications, Exit to the Blind Spot, was made in 2019 by the youngest artist in the exhibition, whose name is Dana Kavelina, and whose film is also projected behind this wall, and I encourage you all to take the time and watch it in its entirety. It lasts 20 minutes, and we kind of all agreed that it's a brilliant masterpiece of animation and kind of subconscious stream of consciousness poem about war and about both historical complications of Donbas and of situations of women in war, fate of women in war, which is Kavelina's main interest. In this series, she refers to 4 events, 4 particular war events in which rape was used as a tool of war. Both the artist and we all know that it was not about 4 wars, but in all wars, rape is used as a tool, as a weapon. She focused here on pogroms in Lviv in 1941 by the Germans and the Ukrainians on Jewish women, the deportations of the Chechens on Stalin's orders in 1944, the 1990s rape camps organized by the Serbs on Bosnian women during the wars in Yugoslavia, and finally the events currently in mostly in Donbas, in Ukraine. Language is a very important, text is a very important aspect of her works, and they really change their meaning. If you read, of course, what she writes is in Russian, but every text is translated here, and it's good to have a look at them. For example, this work says, after the war, we're all tied together. This one says, honor and dishonor. This one says a woman kills the child of her enemy. And this one, nation, from Latin, to give birth. So as you look at them, you see that she really looks deeply into the concept of a nation that is built on the concept of pure blood or common blood that she is criticizing, and that where she sees the roots of problem with rape being used in the wars. Why I said it has something to do with what Lesia said? Well, the first time this work was shown was in a museum in Kyiv in Ukraine in 2019, where she placed these drawings without frames, just plain on the wall, between huge monumental Soviet paintings of war, which all had very heroic kind of narration of victory. And Kavelina says that behind every monument to the war hero, there is a shadow, and that all of them are linked by the bloody lingerie of women, because all wars are the wars against women. So that's one tie to historical painting. Another, and probably even closer tie, is covered with these 3 cloths. This is how watercolors are displayed in many Ukrainian, but also some other European museums for a very simple reason, to protect them from light. And I actually advise it for your private collections. It's a very useful way to have them not in the drawers, but be able to look at your works. Sherbina is an artist who actively subverts traditional academical traditions of painting, understanding them as patriarchal hierarchies, where, you know, historical painting, war painting is higher in this hierarchy than landscape painting, which is higher than Naturmort, and so on and so on and so on. In this particular series, she addressed the tradition, very popular in 18th and 19th century Europe, of painting ruins. And of course, she's forcing me to do what you are not doing right now, but I am doing, which is coming close to the work. That's her intention. When you do that, you will see what I see now, which are beautiful lyrical landscapes, and you have to really look close to realize that these are ruins of Donbas. The artist made them based on her trips with a humanitarian organization called SOS Vostok. I always say that most of the artists in this exhibition are politically involved. They're involved in humanitarian efforts. They've been involved politically for years. Vlada Ralko, one of the best known Ukrainian artists, she is probably in her 50s, so very well established artist already. As you see, another, Lesia, you always complain of this fantastic academic, background and education, but the craft is pretty incredible. These drawings, the paintings, the combination of the quality of art and the conceptual approach to art is quite rare, and that's what strikes me about Ukrainian art the most. The combination just makes them fantastic. These drawings were all made in the spring of this year. They are called Lev Diary. The artist takes a daily notation of what's going on. She's very well known for a similar diary that she did during the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, which was called Kyiv Diary. This one is called Lviv because this is where she came from Kyiv while escaping to the West in the last days of February. You will, of course, recognize certain symbols. This figure, for example, refers to the massacre in Bucha, where victims were found with hands tied in the back. This one to the bombing of the theater in Mariupol in mid-March, I believe, which was clearly signed with these letters, Dzieci, which means children. A kind of anchor for this exhibition, again, we can tie it to to what I just mentioned about political activism of the artists in the show. Our Horska, the only historical work in the entire exhibition of an incredibly important artist who I always repeated, and I hope everybody will repeat it, and it will help us all appreciate her more in the West. She means to Ukrainian culture what Frida Kahlo means to Mexican. And there are many reasons to make this comparison. Most importantly, for this exhibition, she's an anchor that keeps all the exhibition in one place. She provides a legacy of Ukrainian women's art and political activism in previous decades of the 20th century. In this particular work, it's a linocut from 1963. She made a portrait of Ivan Svetlichny, who was a poet and literary critic, and both of them were very active in the group of Ukrainian dissidents literati and artists who organized a club of intellectual exchange in Kyiv, and they promoted poetry written in Ukrainian folk songs, Ukrainian tradition of the language, but also visual traditions of art, and officially denounced socialist realism in painting. Well, they paid both very steep price for it. Svetlichny spent 12 years of his life in the lagers, and Awa Horska was murdered most probably by the KGB in 1970 at the age of 41. What is important in her work is not only her political activism, but also the fact that creating under communism in this very, very gray period of 1960s under Stalinism, where repressions were quite horrible, she, with one of her hands, represented, the builders of communism and heroic figures of miners and soldiers, but on the other, fantastic figures tying to the magical realism of the folk art of Ukraine. I really recommend to you to look up this artist. She created beautiful public mosaics, monumental mosaics in Donbas and in other parts of Ukraine. And when you think of these mosaics, you can really think about Mexican muralism. There is something that translates. We're speaking about monumentalism. Do you have anything else that you would like to add about your paintings?
Actually, I would make small introduction when such kind of works come from. I was working with the image of the soldier for 3 years already, and last year I was preparing a big solo show in Kyiv in National Art Museum. it should be opened in June. And that project, I was focusing on two different aspects of looking on the soldiers, looking on the war. First of all, I was based in Kyiv, and war was happened, of course, in the east. Like we got a lot of refugees in Kyiv, so we were like in a, let's say, privileged situation. And of course, we were thinking about it critically. And so I was looking through this perspective of being inside the war, but being in a safe place and being in, like, for me was very complicated and impossible to express what it means to be in a war. At the same time, I was working with the issue of World War II through the biography of my grandfather, who was a painter, but he was a soldier in a Ukrainian Soviet army occasionally. He was not like soldier, he was like got there because of hunger, because he was too young, but he was already a young artist. And he was drawing maps and did a lot of things. And I worked with his biography and made big monumental painting based on his memories. Like that paintings should confront official Stalinistic kind of visual representation of the war. And I claim that it's a true history because it's based on a personal story. But at the same time, after years, I was wondering that my grandfather was a painter, mostly landscape painter of 60s, but he did several paintings about World War II, World War II, but he didn't depict his own story. He depicts some very universal image about, like, you know, like in Soviet time, it was not allowed to speak from the first position. Even veterans always were talking about, like in propaganda dimension. And I was comparing his practice with my own, that I'm a witness of the war. And I'm also in the figurative painting tradition. So I compared two kind of narration and building history through images. And I was working in his studio in Kyiv. He passed away, but I occupied that place. And the windows of the studio was in the front of army department, army yard. So I was observing soldiers from the sniper perspective because it was under the roof. And I was thinking about this view and about this witnessing the war, being in the safe place, and what does it mean to be an artist, just to focus on something, to some obvious thing. And I was spying that soldiers from window of my studio, taking photo with my iPhone, on zooming them, and thinking about two kind of view of shooter, of sniper, and of artist. And I thought that artists always go on the surface of the body, but shooter wanted to go through. That was my point. To compare, to put myself not in the like privileged situation of artist, but to put myself into dangerous situation, and the situation of objectivization of the body of other. Through this, I wanted to deconstruct idea of the war. But when full-scale invasion happened, we experienced much more brutal images of the war. If this penetration of the body by bullet, it's like quite erotic gesture. So what we experienced, it's more pornography, because like our internet is a full of disgusting dead bodies. And we, as a society, since March, every day are looking on these bodies. So experience of looking on the bodies from the perspective, from the professional perspective and from perspective of citizens, of people, it's changed a lot. And I think that in next years will be very, so it will change society, not only Ukrainian society, I think, this kind of experience. And for me, these figures are also not very clear what I'm looking on, but I can't take photo from my studio for the first because I left Kyiv, and for the second because it's not allowed to take photo of real soldiers. So I'm taking images from open sources, and in that condition, pixelating, blurring, obscuring, blurring backgrounds. And I'm thinking that it's like new kind of human beings, a little bit more robots, less humans, maybe. So I'm layering my interpretation above what I'm looking on. I'm putting those images in a one line with a traditional representation of the soldiers in a history of paintings, or some battle paintings itself, and in the same time in the line of the pop culture, which goes next to war footage in internet. So when I'm scrolling my, I don't know, Instagram or other kind of resources, blogs, I'm looking at the images from the war, and at the same time I'm looking at some pop advertisement of, I don't know, superheroes movie, for example. So for me, it's in the one space, internet space. So I think it's very interesting to talk about it, how we experience real life, and through this manipulation, through this editing by soldiers, I could claim that they really turned to superhero. So it's like kind of post-production. And I would like to make them a little bit scary, to question if this post-human kind of consciousness exists, if we dehumanize like other or not, from which point of view we are looking on it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, it's fascinating. The next work is, we will now just go in the same direction. The next work has nothing to do with monumentalism, quite to the contrary, and it's also quite different in its nature as a chronological story. It starts here and it develops in chronological order. The artist is very well known, Alewtina Kahidze, and she tells us the story of her mother, who stayed behind in Donbas in a little town called Żdanivka. She was a gardener. Alewtina, by the way, is an eco-feminist artist who also does a lot of work, conceptual work with plants. So the gardening, whether conceptual or not, runs in the family. She was very influenced by her mom, and I think it was one of the reasons. I'm speculating why why people stay in the territory where there is constant danger, there's constant shelling. She could escape to her daughter, but there was no way she would leave her home. And many people in situations like this, I always, back and again and again and again, compare the situation to what we have seen when Katrina came to New Orleans, right? There are always people who will stay at home. So Alewtina's mother, who had a very lovely nickname of Strawberry, stayed, and we see her in the first days of the when separatists took over local government and put military checkpoints everywhere. This is their flag here. This is April 2014. I think Żdanivka was taken over on 14th of April, so the third day of this whole revolt. And they communicated over the phone. The only place where the signal still worked, the cell phone signal, was a local cemetery, and Aleftina's mother, like other elderly, had to go there to tell their kids that they were still alive. So there's a pinch of humor in those, like, you know, almost cartoons, and of course, as we go, the story becomes more tragic. Somebody gets killed, and it is simply a matter of everyday conversation, a matter and a child talking on the phone. What's going on with you? Kakidze used this story to almost illustratively used the very famous feminist idea of the personal is the political, where she made the story of her mother a symbol or a conduit to tell Ukrainian society the story of 500,000 pensioners in Donbas who stayed there and who, in order to receive their pensions, would have to report on the Ukrainian side of the demarcation line more than once a month. I think it was twice a month that they have to come. And if you look closer at this drawing here in the middle, this is the flag of the separatists, this is the flag of Ukraine. There's a demarcation line in between, 66 kilometers, 11 hours, and Aleftina's mother says, it took me 11 hours to cross a distance which I crossed before the war in 1.5 hours. So if you imagine that all these elderly people have to do that several times, and they do that not relaxed and in buses with AC, but there is shelling going on, there are checkpoints, their documents are being checked by the military people on both sides of the demarcation line. This is an extremely stressful situation. Beyond this 500,000 people who registered to still continue and receive the pensions from the Ukrainian government, there was another, in 2018, there was another 700,000 who didn't even register. So we're talking about 1.2 million of retirees who stayed in Donbas, in which at that point there were about 3 million people living in the whole region. The story doesn't end well. Aleftina's mother passed away during one of those excursions. She got a cardiac arrest and she died at the military checkpoint. Earlier, Lesia mentioned the effort to render the war and the history in an objective way, or render any truth. And this is a peculiar interest and focus of this artist, Yevgenia Belarusets, also one of the best-known Ukrainian artists and a very accomplished writer. She just had her book, which got awards in Germany, now translated in the United States. It was published by New Directions this spring, and it's titled Lucky Breaks. And her book is a little like her photographs. It contains small moments, fragments of life, which cannot in easy way be connected together. And it is Belarus's way to resist the politicization and the political narrations of war. She focuses on the life of regular people, and she says that our human life, that our look at human fates during the war is so much more important than our looking at the battles. Here in this series titled Victories of the Defeated, she focuses on labor rights in Donbas, where miners still work during the ongoing war. 5 more photographs from this series are here. This is Vera Yastrebova, a local labor right activist in Lysychansk. and other women, but not only women, whom she met and interacted with during creating this project. It's a long series of 150 photographs, of which we selected a few. Speaking about minors, this is a different work by a different artist whose name is Elena Grom. And she refers in it to not only the fate of children during the armed conflict, but also the phenomenon that women actually give birth during wars. In the series, which is titled Womb, she represents women with children and children who were born during this war in Donbas and spent most of her childhood in cellars, hiding from the shelling. She refers this way also to the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus, who was a Greek god who, according to the Greek myth, stole the fire from other gods and gave it to people. But also in some versions of the myth, he created men from clay. So in Soviet art, also in Auerhorska's mosaics, miners are represented as heroic, beautiful Prometheus. Well, she's showing a little bit of a different relationship with Earth that the children of miners have today in Donbas. And in her, it's interesting who is looking at these photographs. When we see this picture, we may feel the misery or like feel sorry for the children, but in her intention, it is quite to the contrary. She is always showing life during the war. She rejects showing death and tries to pick those little, the little rays of hope or of light. And that's her intention behind photographing children in the war. Her personal story is also quite incredible. She lost her home in Donetsk immediately when the war in Donbas started in 2014. They just finished building a new house, she and her husband. And she had to flee, and she moved to Bucha. So this February 23rd, the moment Putin ended his expose, she told me, I was in the car with one suitcase and with my boy 5 minutes after he finished speaking. And even before the invasion started, they had to the south and to the west of Ukraine. And interestingly, because she actually started working as a professional photography artist after she lost Donbas, her land, her kind of place in the world. She used photography as a way to go back there and to be involved with people and to somehow to document it. And the same now happens with Bucha. She goes and documents every day life in Bucha, people who returned after the massacre and what's going on there. I recommend to you checking her Instagram for that. The photograph here is by Olya Fyodorova, the same artist who wrote the poem, which is at the entrance of the gallery. Mental health is something that women artists speak quite openly. And I think it's impossible to imagine what kind of constant trauma and fear the land invasion on your country forces people into. Being in fear for weeks, for months, for years, affects the entire society in Ukraine. And here in this work from 2017, Olya Fyodorova, who has lived and worked in Kharkiv, which was not attacked until February 24th of this year. And so this work is made 5 years ago. She imagined this anti-tank hedgehogs made of paper in actually scale 1:1 as a metaphor for the futility of the mind to escape the war that is always present, even if your territory is not affected yet. Zhana Kadyrova, this video and bread on the table are one artwork together with the artist text, which I'm not sure, I think it's here on the wall. The work is titled Palyanica. Thank you. Palyanica is a typical Ukrainian bread and is a very important word in current war. Do you want to talk about Palyanica and the meaning of it?
Palyanica is a word which is for Russians. It's very difficult to spell, so it was to pronounce, and for some reasons it was detection of because like a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian, but Ukrainians like bilingual people mostly, so they could easily speak Ukrainian and Russian. Yeah, but some specific sound Russian can't pronounce. So when we had a lot of some small groups of militaries who go deep inside the cities on the beginning of the war. Agents and like militaries, like with small groups. So to detect them, like Ukrainian militaries used such kind of words, or they captured and then asked. So it was like meme, of course, like every kid knows that Palyanica is the main detector. Beam, yeah, sir. Yeah, but basically it's also bread. It's a quite old-fashioned title of the bread. And you know that the food problem is huge, that Russia blocked this sea way to export grain. So it's double meaning, and it's like stone bread, maybe.
Yes, Zhana Kadyrova, who's the artist, we didn't even mention her name yet. She might be the best known artist in the US because she was present so many times in, yeah, that's Zhana, in Venice. She represented Venice in the Ukrainian Pavilion, and she also was included in 2019 main exhibition. So she's quite well known for her works in which she's an artist who's extremely sensitive to materials in the landscape, in the surroundings of her. And she often worked with tokens of Soviet public space, like post-Soviet urban landscape, the concrete, the tiles, the smalt that is used in mosaics. And here she found herself escaping Kyiv this spring in March of 2022 in this little village in Transcarpathia or Zakarpattia, right? Towards the border with Romania or Hungary. So that's in the far west of Ukraine where it's safe. That's her husband. And they took over, they rented this house and they started to think what they can do now. Like, what can artists do during the war? It's a question that all of the artists in this exhibition ask themselves. And I'm waiting for the moment in the film, you will see it later, there's beautiful landscape there. This film really is a window into Ukraine. And she noticed rivers with all those beautiful stones and started to make breads out of them. It's a fundraising project for the Ukrainian war effort. They are sold by her gallery, which is present all around the world, Galleria Continua, by weight. 1 gram costs $1. So, of course, you cannot buy one slice, you have to buy the whole loaf. But the artist donates 100% of proceeds towards the war effort. The film is fascinating. You will indeed see Ukrainian landscape and the whole process of making these breads. Everybody asked us in New York, no, there is no paint involved. They really made them, just cutting and polishing the stone. So whoever saw her work in Venice, where she did those markets with fruits made of cement and tiles, you know, there's something. She translated another material into another food. And as Lesia said, the meaning of the work slightly tilted, changed as Russians started to shoot wheat fields in Ukraine and the port in Odessa. We have one more artwork. You can call it the first or the last in this arrangement. That's a very personal work by the same artist who did the photograph of the snow landscape with anti-tank hedgehogs. It's a poem, one of the 10 poems that she wrote this March from March through May in her cellar, which served as a shelter in Kharkiv. Kharkiv was bombed every day since February 24th until May 12th, when there was a short break for a week when Ukrainians pushed Russians beyond the Russian border back again. Kharkiv is only 50 kilometers, I don't know how many miles, it's probably around 30 few miles, really close to the border, so it's difficult to protect this city. And it's an academic city. It's a city where you have the most universities in Ukraine, so it's a very important place. The first few poems address the enemy in an open way. I will read the poem. May you choke on my soil, may you poison yourself with my air, may you drown in my waters, may you burn in my sunlight, may you stay restless all day and night, and may you be afraid every second. And of course, that's what the artist feels, and she tries to project that feeling onto the enemy. All 10 poems are on her website. They're all translated there. That's written in Ukrainian, so you can not only look at the landscape, but you can also look at the language. And the first few address the enemy, and then the language changes. Then somewhere in the middle, there is a fantastic poem about the empire, that the empire rottens and it will fall apart. And then towards the end, the mood changes entirely, and in the last poem, Olia wrote, she addressed it directly to God, and she asked so that she could always remember where she comes from, but so that this kind of memory doesn't overwhelm her completely, her entire life. And she asked not to have nightmares until the end of her life. And she left Kharkiv, and she lives in Graz in Austria now. It's interesting. Somebody asked us during the press conference about materials, about why so many drawings, etc. This is also the work that was created because there was no access. There is no access during the war to materials artists would usually use. So you either have a pencil or you have only your laptop. Olia works with landscape. She cannot work in Ukraine today because there's no landscape, there is no destroyed or mined, but that was a way of entering her own internal landscape and rendering it with words. Again, nothing else but felt pen and bed linens. That is all I have to say about. We went through all the works. Thank you all for listening, for coming to this exhibition, and we will stay here, so if you have more questions, we will all be very happy to answer them. I want to say that Ilya Friedman, director of the Friedman Gallery, who produced this exhibition in New York, is also here, and you can also ask him questions, as well as Julia and Lesia. Thank you so very much.